Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you all eventually have the experience of being introduced by Barbara Tober. It's a great experience. Thank you so much, Barbara. Great friend. Not for as many years as Tony, but certainly for quite a few, and thank you so much for the support over the years. It's great to be here with you in Santa Fe at this extraordinary and rather unique gathering. I'm going to be giving you a talk about place, but I'd like to begin with an image that seems, in fact, like nowhere at all. At least nowhere you could visit. It looks like an image of a distant planet, perhaps, captured from a satellite telescope, or at the other end of the scale spectrum, perhaps a blood corpuscle or a single-cell organism from the deep sea, captured through a powerful electron microscope. In fact, however, it is none of these things. It was made in a garden shed with nothing but a lens and light and some water. And it is a work by the artist Gary Fabien Miller, who lives in the English village of Dartmoor in County Devon. For many years, Gary has made his images without mechanical cameras, instead using a hand-built walk-in studio, comparable to a historic camera obscura, but it looks more like a garden shed, really. And for most of his career, his practice has involved using light-reactive film in this space, which he places in a certain configuration on the floor of the darkroom, sometimes facing straight up, as here, sometimes at an angle. He then exposes the paper to the light, sometimes through a depth of water or oil, or both, for a certain period of time, carefully calibrating the amount of light and the duration of the exposure, sometimes for minutes and often as long as 20 hours. As his exposures unfold, he occasionally re-enters the darkroom space, making adjustments, intervening, working in active collaboration, as he says, with the forces of nature. The results vary depending on atmospheric and light conditions, and he's the only artist I know, in fact, that on his website organizes his works by the season in which they were made. With these simple means, Gary has been able to generate images of extraordinary range and beauty. Many, like this one, have a luminous imprint at their center, resembling the sun itself. But actually, what it's indexing is the tiny aperture in the studio roof, the roof of that garden shed, through which the light is entering with the force of a revelation. Other of his pictures are flashes, disposed vertically or horizontally. They seem like pure transient light plucked from the air, from the ether, preserved for all time. They might prompt thoughts of a gestural brushstroke, perhaps. Specifically, I'm thinking here of the paintings of Barnett Newman, the artist of the abstract expressionist era, who saw his famous zips as a visual expression of existentialist philosophy. Newman understood a canvas with a single horizontal stripe as the ultimate landscape painting, nothing but a horizon and the act of looking itself. His vertical zips, which you're perhaps more familiar with, he also thought of as markers of place and time. Each of these paintings, at least from his perspective, said to its viewer, you are here and now, in this moment, in this spot. Nothing else matters, only the aesthetic encounter. Newman's works seem almost to gain in power with the passing years since they were made. There is something in this work about place that is so uncompromising, so direct, that we can perhaps learn from it today. And so leaping forward to here and now, in the present, here we are, at least Google Maps version of where we are. I was struck by the difference between an understanding of this place as presented on the internet and this place as presented by the mayor of Santa Fe earlier, Ogo Page, the native language for this place, a kind of welcome to country that he offered us. So when a location where your body exists is served up to you by, well, I guess served up to by servers, those distant digital repositories of information, which we all use to navigate our daily lives as surely as mariners used to navigate by the stars, I think it's worth asking, even as we are guided unerringly to our destinations by the smooth and frictionless operations of our portable devices, and maybe that's how you actually made it here today to the conference. In a deeper sense, maybe we should be asking the question, are we actually getting lost? Maybe we actually need a little friction in our lives, a little less portability. Maybe, and I know this is an event about art, place, and technology, maybe what we need is less technology and more of a sense of place. And that's the question I want to entertain with you in this talk. And it's one that requires us to dig deep, I think, in order to find the answers. I'm going to go super deep to the ancient world and to the Romans, who believed in the existence of a guardian spirit who had a protective role over each of their sacred sites. And this, of course, is the term genius loci that I've used for the name of my talk, really signifying a spirit that stands watch over a place. Now, over time, that term has come to mean something a bit broader. It's been used in various different ways, often tinged with that kind of mysticism that the Romans attached to it. The idea is that every place has its own character, perhaps even its own sacred qualities. And this is a familiar set of beliefs in other cultures as well, notably in the Shinto religion of Japan, which immediately springs to mind perhaps. It's in deference to the kami, the Shinto equivalent of the genius loci, you could say, that certain places like Ise are marked with these famous upswept torii gates. And famously, as you may know, the actual shrine at Ise is rebuilt every 20 years as an act of renewal, so it is the place, not the architecture here, that matters. Even so, the notion of genius loci has also particularly animated the work of architects over the years, perhaps unsurprisingly. The idea that a building should be a tectonic expression of its site, of its special place, has been the deep root from which many great architects have blossomed, among them, just to stay with Japan for a moment, the architect Tadao Ando, whose buildings, and here I'm showing you the Clark Art Institute, relatively recent project in Western Massachusetts. These buildings often seem not so much like additions to the landscape as completions of it. And of course, architects like Ando have also sought to create an indelible sense of place within their structures. And perhaps it's no coincidence that this unrealized proposal by Ando for a church of light arrives at the same essential vocabulary as Gary Fabien Miller's photographs and Barnett Newman's paintings. A similar spirit animates one of this year's CODA Award winners, the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin, Texas, where the renowned artist, recently deceased, unfortunately, artist Ellsworth Kelly, collaborated with the glass manufacturer Meyer of Munich to realize what they called a secular chapel, which alludes to medieval Romanesque architecture. The result is this brilliant study in color harmony and primary form, doing in polychrome something like what Tadao Ando's Church of Light tried to do in black and white. And because Kelly tragically died in 2015, the project could also be considered a kind of inadvertent memorial to him, to his memory, to his relationship to color, in which sophistication and love were blended in equal amounts. But let's go back to Gary Fabien Miller for a moment. Here he is at his home in Dartmoor, the place where the magic happens. It's most unusual in his field, the field of photography, to sit in one place as he does. Most of his fellow photographers are creatures of the road. They snatch images as they drift by in the current of experience. But Miller describes his life in terms that are reminiscent instead of a country craftsman, sort of like a potter working at his quiet trade. But here's the thing, history doesn't stop and let you off just because you found a place you like. And this is a common misunderstanding, I think. We tend to associate place with permanence, just as we wrongly associate craftsmanship with tradition and oppose craft to technology. In fact, craft and technology are best conceived simply as different aspects of the same thing. For a firm grounding, both in a sense of place and in a depth of skill, is precisely what helps you adapt to change. So here we might think of craft not so much as an anchor, rooting you to a spot, but rather as a rudder that allows you to navigate the future. And if you'll forgive another piece of antique terminology, I'll remind you that the word technology derives from the Greek techne, which means craft or skill. And all the Greeks meant by that word, really, is the ability to do things well by hand, an ability that technology, at its best, extends rather than destroys. So yes, to return to the key question that I wanted to pose with you today, we have always needed a sense of place, and we always will, but technology, if brought into union with art, maybe if and only if brought into union with art, can itself be a way to find it. And that, of course, is what we're here at CODA to talk about. So let me tell you what happened to Gary Fabien Miller before I leave him. And it's a lot like, I guess you could say a lot like what would happen to a potter if the entire world ran out of clay. Because the particular type of paper, a sebachrome dye destruction paper that he always used and had used for decades, went out of production. There was no call for it anymore. He'd used it for 35 years, knew its capabilities like a concert pianist knows a keyboard. But the digital revolution came, and sebachrome was no more. So how did he react? Not by riding off into the sunset. Instead, he figured if you can't beat him, join him. And so he has now embraced digital processes, building pixel by pixel a light pattern, which can then be rendered as a photographic print, like one you see here. And in fact, he's entered exactly the space that you were just hearing about that Epson is so strongly associated with, these extremely high quality art photography printers. And what's rather wonderful is that in some cases he's then taken these digitally produced images and returned them to the world of the analog by rendering them into the ancient medium of tapestry. And I showed you a detail of this being woven a moment ago. So here we have another horizon, another work about a horizon, but in addition to being a spatial horizon, as if it were the sunset meeting the Earth from underneath, it's also a temporal horizon in which both past and future seem to recede inexorably from the present. Now, I realize that most of you attending the summit this week don't work in a garden shed, and most of you, I think, are not even necessarily studio artists, or not only that. You are entrepreneurs, you are technologists, you don't hide out in the country, you dedicate yourselves to working in public space. The more people you reach, the better. But I think it's important to stress that in so many ways you have common cause with craftspeople and artists like Gary Fabien Miller, who has a strong artistic vision and must surf the waves of shifting technological change as best he can. It's something we're all in together. So let us put it this way. It's a given that technology is becoming pervasive. And just as much of the internet has become commercialized or otherwise junked up, and I'm sure we can all think of examples of that, the worry now is that the same thing is going to happen to our sense of place, particularly as technology is escaping the narrow confines of our screens and more entering what I'm tempted to call real space, the one you actually can walk around inside of. So here's the question. Which would you rather inhabit? A place that no artist was ever let near? Or one that an artist had touched with their mind and hands and heart? And this, of course, is why we need art so badly. Not to resist the waves of technological change, but to embrace them, to articulate them, to direct them to humane purposes. An obvious example is Millennium Park in Chicago, which was utterly transformed by Anish Kapoor's Cloudgate, an extraordinary feat of both technology and craft. It was digitally designed, and it looks, frankly, like something out of a science fiction film, but it was realized with a lot of old-fashioned metalworking and welding and weeks of polishing by hand. The result is equally evocative of a traditional silver object, like a teapot, say, from the 18th century, and also of a computer screen. It literally holds the image of Chicago in itself, in its reflection. So when we talk about public art capturing a sense of place, perhaps this is what we mean. But of course, there's other ways to do this other than an enormous metal sculpture plonked in the middle of a park. In fact, you could say that the most exciting artistic material of the 21st century is data itself. We already heard a little bit about this today. Until recently, the idea of data visualization was for most people really just the domain of printed graphic design, and if they ran into it at all, they probably ran into it in the bottom left-hand corner of USA Today. That was data visualization. But beginning around 2005, at least that's when I started to become aware of it, there started to be increasing interest in this field, and pioneering computer artworks like this one, Aaron Coblin's Flight Path, which is actually an animation I'm just showing you is still here, started to be created. So here what Koblin does is to render a very, very big place, North America, into this mesmerizing visualization, this rendering, a day's worth of commercial flights which are compressed into the space of a few minutes. And what you get from that, of course, is a sense not only of geographical space, but also connectivity, the networking of people, networking of cities, flows of capital. More recently, as computational power has increased, data visualization has been employed in increasingly imaginative and provocative ways. For example, the London-based office Forensic Architecture uses data visualization techniques in the spirit of political fact-finding, something that we could probably all use a little bit more of. So in this case, in the wake of a chemical attack in the city of Douma, part of the seemingly unending tragedy and horror of the civil war in Syria, government authorities had claimed that the canisters holding nerve agents that had landed in this building had not been launched by the forces of President Assad, but had actually been planted after the fact in order to discredit him. And so what forensic architecture did was to go into the information, photographic and otherwise, that they could gather about this building, capture it and extrapolate from it. They were able to demonstrate conclusively that the attack had indeed been directed from the air and therefore was actually to be laid at the feet of Assad's forces. In another recent project, forensic architecture used satellite imagery to reconstruct the exact sequence of violence that occurred in the city of Rafah on the Gaza Strip, where 150 people were killed during a single day. And again, for them, this was a way of assessing responsibility for atrocities, fighting fiction with facts. And this is a very different sense of place. Here, place is understood as the scene of a crime. At least that's one way that you could understand this documentary work. But what I find fascinating is that it's also very beautiful. It's kind of alluring, this rendering, and this is of course purposeful. Just like any architect who uses imagery to persuade a client, forensic architecture harnesses the aesthetic potential of information in order to draw attention to the issues that they care about, issues that otherwise might be missed. And maybe this is the important part of data visualization, that it makes the invisible visible. I've spent a moment on data visualization because, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in recent years these techniques have started to enter public space and to be absolutely fundamental to the future of public art in what I would describe as highly crafted or bespoke ways. And a perfect example of this is the work of Andrea Pauly, who is one of the panelists at this summit, speaking later this afternoon, who has previously also been recognized by CODA for her public artworks in Pittsburgh and elsewhere, many of which focus on climate change. So in this project, which is called Energy Flow, she reimagined an entire suspension bridge as a statistical indicator. Its shifting light array changes based on real-time wind speed and direction, and it shows how much power can be generated from wind. So it's a kind of almost like a utopian gesture in the direction of a more ecologically sustainable approach to energy. And in this stunning piece, Particle Falls, a detector uploads the quantity of pollutant particles that are present in the air, literally in front of that building, and transmutes the information into a large-scale abstract light display, a projection, as we were hearing about before. So if a bus pulls up in front of the building lights up like a Christmas tree, making the conditions of that place in that moment evident to dramatic effect. Now, of course, not all public artworks using big data are political. Sometimes the intention is simply to create a sense of place where there was none before, through sheer splendor. Here I'm showing you Convergence LA, a work by Susan Narduli and Refik Anadol. And I should mention here that Refik, who of course is very close to CODA, is a real pioneer in this field and is one of the originators of what we now call data sculpture and data painting. So this project is located at Metropolis Towers in downtown Los Angeles, and it processes 4 million information points per hour across several data sets: demographic, astronomical, oceanographic, tectonic, and environmental. And then it presents various animations to the public. Here, example, are 2 frames that track metro traffic in the city, rather like Aaron Coblin's flight paths, but here now exposed to the public as they pass by. And just like Anish Kapoor's Cloudgate in Chicago, projects like these show that a sense of place can prevail in the big city, not just in small and beautiful rural sites. In fact, technology is partly potent because of the way that it can scale the sense of place, genius loci, up and down. Through digital scanning and 3D printing, we can now make a small thing big or a big thing tiny. Convergence LA is a great example of doing the same with place. The work is utterly of Los Angeles, and its sprawling highway system here, which is too vast to be easily comprehended, is compressed into an understandable, legible form. A related work is among the other winners of this year's CODA Awards. It's in West Hollywood and is by the artist Janet Eckelman. It's a sky sculpture inspired by a Native American dream catcher, which, as the artist knows well, is something of an overused cliche. And the historical origins of the dream catcher are as much to be found in objects made for the tourist trade as any authentic native spiritual tradition. Yet she has found ways to breathe life into this motif using electronic mapping of the brainwaves of a sleeping person to design the work. So it's a kind of metaphorical extension of the idea of what a dream catcher does into the 21st century. As you look up to the oculus of this piece, it conveys the same powerful message as Barnett Newman's painting sought to do, but now they're updated to the 21st century, to the contemporary metropolis. So the message is, you are here, you are still here. This reintroduction of the textile theme brings me to one last example, which is by Andrew Zulte, another contributor to this year's summit. And I think it's just the most beautiful example of how analog and digital technologies and modes of production can work together. Essentially what Zulte and his team at Breakfast Studio did was to engineer spools of thread to work as if they were digital pixels, and therefore to reimagine a giant screen as a mobile tapestry. And you can see the kind of secret here. This is what's behind the curtain. A color spectrum that is wrapped around each spool. And when digitally signaled, this machine rotates until the specific color that's desired is visible to the front. The Threadscreen is also equipped with an interactive feature, so it can render any picture sent to it by the public immediately. And in fact, all you have to do is hashtag on Instagram. You just put hashtag 21Threadscreen, and then that image will pop up on the screen, like that. The fact that this project was sponsored by a fashion retailer, to me, makes it even more interesting, because clearly it's only if the major forces in our capitalist culture, which is to say corporations and government entities, are able to get behind projects like this, that we can really transform our landscape for the better. So this is, Tony said earlier that she wants to see the entire world filled with public artworks of this caliber. Obviously, if that's going to happen, then companies like Forever 21 need to get behind the idea, and we all need to figure out a way to get them behind the idea. Now, I realize that there's a kind of obvious critical response here, which is to say this is just a bit of fun, nothing more than that. It's cool to see a selfie turned into a 13-foot tall work of textile art, but it is anything more than that. And to that I would say, yes, it is, and here's why. I'm gonna now refer to a critic that Tony actually told me about, Laurent Vernet, and his writing on public space. And he makes the very interesting point that a public artwork in a public space is something like a stranger. In other words, like someone you don't know. So we might not spend a lot of time looking at a public artwork or actively engaging it, and we might not even notice it. So for all that Threadscreen is amazing, for example, I can imagine someone walking right past it, maybe with their own head buried in their phone, sending a text or checking Google Maps or checking some other corner of Instagram besides the Threadscreen. And the same here in Times Square, which has this long-running program called Midnight Moment, in which its famous LCD screens are devoted to a single artwork for a minute. And here I'm showing you an example, which is the work of the artist Pippilotti Rist, who hilariously seems to press herself up against the digital billboards as if yearning to breathe free. And if you blink, you might miss this. But you know what? If we didn't have public artworks like these, of the type that CODAworks has done so much to support, then we would certainly all be the poorer for it. And where we don't have them yet, whether we know it or not, we already miss having them there. That's the real point that I would like to, in a way, leave you with in conclusion, that where you don't have public art, what you have is just a lack of creativity in the public realm. And this obviously opens the way for technology to invade our spaces in means that are not aestheticized, are not personalized, or not humanized. And this is what Laurent Vernet is saying about the importance of strangers as well, strangers in public space. Imagine walking into Times Square or into a Roman piazza and finding it completely empty. It could be the most beautiful space in the world, here, the piazza in front of St. Peter's. But after a minute of appreciating the quiet, I bet you would find it spooky. Like one of those apocalyptic end-of-the-world films, sort of looking for the zombies to come out. Because what makes it public, what makes it a public place and not a ruin, is not the architecture. It's not that the columns aren't fallen over. It's the presence of other people and other minds. The real meaning of a place, past, present, and future, is the people who made it and who continue to inhabit it and breathe meaning into its fabric, whether stones or screens. So instead of asking where we can find the spirit of place today, where we find genius loci, maybe we should ask a different question, which is who is genius loci, or who are the geniuses of loci? And here at CODAsummit, I think we know the answer. You are. So thank you all very much for the work you do, and thank you for listening.